All right, let's talk about W.B. Yeats. Specifically, let's talk about the one poem that has become the go-to anthem for any time the world feels like it's completely coming apart at the seams.
You know these lines, right? I mean, you've heard them everywhere. They just perfectly capture that stomach-dropping feeling of total collapse. But here's the twist. The man who wrote them had a really strange and, frankly, super controversial belief about what a poet should do in a time of chaos.
And that's the big puzzle we're going to unpack today. How did the poet who literally argued for silence during wartime end up writing the most powerful poem ever about the chaos that war leaves behind? It's a paradox that really gets to the heart of a huge question. What is art even for? Okay, let's dive right in. We'll start with one side of this paradox, Yeats's case for shutting up. To really get it, we need to rewind the clock a few years before the Second Coming, right to the thick of World War I. So, picture this. It's 1915. The literary giant Henry James is putting together this book to raise money for Belgian war refugees. Super important cause. He asks Yeats for a poem, probably expecting something patriotic or maybe a sad piece about the horrors of war. But what Yeats sent back, well, it was not what anyone was expecting. Instead of a war poem, he sends a poem about not writing a war poem. His point is brutally clear. Poetry has no business getting involved in politics or war. He saw that as the job of statesmen. For Yeats, when an artist tries to set a statesman right, they just end up making propaganda, not art.
So, if poetry isn't supposed to be for fixing the world's problems, who is it for? Well, Yeats tells us it's for these private, quiet, timeless human experiences, the daydreams of a young girl, the memories of an old man. But what's really fascinating here is who's not on the list. The soldier, the citizen, the very people whose lives are being defined by this massive public crisis. Yeats says poetry isn't for them.
And yet, just 4 years later, this is the same poet who writes The Second Coming, a poem that just dives headfirst into the very chaos he said poets should ignore. So, what happened? What changed in those 4 years? The short answer, pretty much everything.
This poem was forged in a perfect storm of crises. The Great War had just ended, leaving all of Europe just completely broken. The Spanish flu was tearing across the world, and it got terrifyingly personal for Yeats when his pregnant wife nearly died. And then, on top of all of that, the Irish War of Independence kicked off, bringing the violence literally to his own country. Suddenly, the chaos wasn't some far-off political problem, it was everywhere.
Now, to make sense of all this, Yeats turned to his own unique, kind of weird mystical system. He didn't see history as a straight line. For him, it was these two giant interlocking cones, or gyres. Imagine a 2,000-year-long hourglass. One side represents an era, say the Christian era. As its sand fills up, it gets wider and wider, more and more unstable, until it hits its limit and collapses. Then, the whole thing flips, and the opposite cone, a new era, begins its own 2,000-year cycle. And in 1919, Yeats was convinced he was living at the exact moment that hourglass was flipping. And you can see that collapse happening step by step in the poem's opening. First, the gyre widens. The whole structure of society is just coming apart. Then, the falcon can't hear the falconer. This isn't just a bird getting lost. It's a symbol for a complete breakdown of authority and communication. And the result is terrifying. Anarchy is loosed, and this blood-dimmed tide just washes away everything good and innocent.
And then he gives us this absolutely chilling diagnosis of a society in freefall. The good people, the thoughtful ones, the best, they're paralyzed with doubt. They can see all the complexity, so they can't act. But the worst, the extremists and the fanatics, they are bursting with absolute passionate certainty. It's a world where the people who want to burn it all down are the only ones with any energy.
And out of that chaos, Yeats has this vision. It comes from what he called the spiritus mundi, kind of like the world's collective soul or memory. And what he sees is horrifying. It's a rough beast, part lion, part man, with a gaze as blank and pitiless as the sun. This thing is the opposite of a savior, and it's not coming in glory. It slouches towards Bethlehem to be born, ready to begin a new, terrifying age. So, you've got this incredibly powerful, terrifying vision of chaos, which seems to completely contradict his earlier idea that poets should stay silent. This whole contradiction really came to a head many years later in a major literary showdown with the poets who had actually been in the trenches. So let's fast forward to 1936. Yeats is now the grand old man of poetry, a Nobel laureate, and he's given this hugely important job, editing the new Oxford Book of Modern Verse. This is basically his chance to decide which poems are going to be remembered for generations. And what does he do? He makes an absolutely jaw-dropping decision. He leaves out the most famous poets from World War I, guys like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. He excludes them completely. The question is, why? His reason gets right to the core of this whole debate. It really all boiled down to a fundamental disagreement on what to do with suffering in art. For Yeats, suffering was only a worthy subject if it involved a hero, someone who chooses their fate and finds a kind of tragic joy in that struggle. He famously said that the soldiers in the trenches experienced passive suffering. They weren't acting, they were being acted upon by a machine of war. And for him, that wasn't a theme for art. But for Wilfred Owen, it was the exact opposite. He believed the poet's highest duty was to show the world that very passive suffering. This line from Owen's preface just says it all. His mission wasn't to find some grand, tragic hero. It was to make you, the reader, feel the pity of it all. The poetry, for him, is the pity. It's a complete and total rejection of Yeats's philosophy.
So here we are, back at the puzzle. The poet who says stay silent on war writes the greatest poem about its aftermath. The man who rejects passive suffering pens the ultimate description of a civilization passively collapsing. So how on earth do we make these two sides of Yeats fit together?
Well, here's the solution. The Second Coming is Yeats' great war poem. He didn't actually refuse to write about violence and chaos. He refused to write journalism about it. He solved his own artistic problem by taking the specific, raw horror of 1919 and transforming it into something bigger, a timeless, terrifying myth. And this table just lays out the different approaches so clearly. You've got Owen, the witness, whose job is to rub your nose in the grotesque reality of the trenches. You've got Sassoon, the angry satirist, attacking the patriotic lies being told back home. And then you have Yeats, his role, the preserver of myth. His imagery isn't visceral, it's abstract and timeless. He wasn't trying to report on the chaos, he was trying to create a myth powerful enough to contain it. And that, really, is why this poem has lasted. By deliberately avoiding the specific blood and dirt of World War I, Yeats created a template for collapse, a myth so universal that it feels just as true for the anxieties of 1919 as it does for our world today. His gyre can be our gyre. His rough beast could be slouching toward our future.
Which leaves us with a huge question, one that's just as urgent now as it was 100 years ago. When things fall apart, what do we really need from our artists? Do we need the witness, the one who documents the suffering with unflinching honesty? Or do we need the mythmaker, the one who gives that suffering a grand, terrifying, and maybe even understandable shape?